Isaiah Carter, a successful black CEO, becomes the target of a corrupt councilman bent on destroying him. After an old photo of Isaiah at a protest is weaponized against him, he is wrongfully arrested on trumped-up charges, exposing the systemic racism and abuse of power he's long fought against. The story highlights infuriating encounters, from racial profiling by law enforcement to a smear campaign designed to silence his voice. As Isaiah navigates blatant prejudice and corruption, his struggle becomes a powerful battle for justice, shedding light on the pervasive racism in America's institutions. The dim glow of the casino chandelier cast a golden haze over the crowded room, its polished crystal refracting light like scattered diamonds. Thomas Aldridge, a sharp-suited man with salt-and-pepper hair and a confident air, leaned casually over the poker table. He smirked, his piercing blue eyes locked on the pile of chips at the center. Across from him sat a younger man, Lucas Marshall. Lucas's hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles pale against his dark skin. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead as he scanned his dwindling stack of chips. He glanced back at Thomas, whose smirk widened. "You've got a choice, son," Thomas drawled, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "Cut your losses, or push everything you've got left into that pile, but I'll warn you." He leaned forward, his smile sharp as a blade. "I don't lose." Lucas's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the crowd behind him, strangers murmuring, their eyes darting between him and Thomas like spectators at a prize fight. But what gnawed at Lucas wasn't the judgment of the onlookers. It was the crushing realization that he'd gambled away more than just money tonight. He had promised himself this would be the last time, the debts, the shame. It all had to end. Yet here he was, sitting across from a man who seemed to embody everything Lucas despised: wealth, arrogance, and a belief that power always won. "I'm not walking away," Lucas said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He pushed his remaining chips into the center, the sound of them scraping against the felt louder than it should have been. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head as if amused by a child's naivety. "Brave, but foolish." He flipped his cards with a flourish, revealing a full house. The room erupted in gasps, but Thomas wasn't looking at the cards, he was watching Lucas, savoring the moment like a predator cornering its prey. Lucas didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his cards face up on the table, and the crowd went silent. The cafe was small, almost quaint, tucked into the corner of a bustling downtown street where skyscrapers loomed overhead. A faint aroma of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked pastries drifted into the air as a gentle hum of conversation filled the space. The decor was modest: wooden tables with mismatched chairs, vintage posters advertising long-defunct bands, and a chalkboard menu listing the daily specials in neat cursive. Isaiah Carter sat at a corner table, his head bowed slightly over his tablet. His broad shoulders filled out the tailored navy blazer he wore, but there was a quiet ease about him, a kind of understated grace. He sipped his coffee, black and steaming, while scrolling through his emails with practiced efficiency. Though his name appeared in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, often enough to draw the envy of lesser men, there was nothing ostentatious about him. His watch was functional, his shoes polished but practical, and the SUV parked outside was luxurious but unassuming compared to the supercars that often dotted this part of the city. Isaiah was a CEO, though he hated the title's connotations. At the helm of his multi-billion-dollar tech firm, Altura Solutions, he had built a reputation not just for brilliance, but for fairness, an anomaly in the cutthroat corporate world. Yet he found solace in places like this cafe, where no one recognized him and where he could briefly disappear into the hum of ordinary life. The room buzzed with the comings and goings of downtown professionals. Suits and blazers brushed by in hurried strides, their briefcases swinging like pendulums. Outside the cafe's large windows, the city pulsed with energy. Taxis honked, street vendors called out to passers-by, and a saxophonist on the corner played a soulful tune that somehow cut through the urban din. Isaiah glanced at his watch. He had a board meeting in an hour, a presentation to finalize, and a dozen pressing emails demanding his attention. Yet for now, he allowed himself this moment of quiet, the soft clink of ceramic cups and the muted shuffle of footsteps grounding him. "Excuse me?" A sharp voice cut through the ambient noise. Isaiah glanced up. The barista, a young woman with a kind but nervous smile, was being confronted by a tall man in a tailored gray suit. His face was flushed, his voice edged with irritation. "I've been standing here for 10 minutes, the man snapped, waving his coffee cup. "This isn't what I ordered. I asked for an Americano, not whatever this is." The barista fumbled with her apron, her apology hurried and flustered. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me fix that for you." "It's not about fixing it," the man interrupted, his voice rising. "It's about basic competence. How hard is it to get a coffee order right?" Isaiah's brow furrowed as he watched the scene unfold. He recognized the man, Bradley Hastings, a senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. Hastings was known for his tenacity in the courtroom and his abrasiveness everywhere else. Isaiah's company had once been a client of Hastings's firm, though he had personally ended the relationship after witnessing Bradley berate one of his own associates during a meeting. The barista's hands trembled as she worked to prepare a new cup, her cheeks flushing a deep red under Bradley's withering glare. "Take your time," Bradley said sarcastically, leaning against the counter as if daring her to falter. His tone carried the kind of arrogance Isaiah had come to recognize too often in men like him. Men who believed their wealth and status entitled them to dominance in every space they entered. Isaiah returned to his coffee, forcing himself to focus on his screen. He had long since learned to pick his battles, especially when it came to men like Bradley. Still, the encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. "Excuse me, sir," another voice called, this one directed at Isaiah. He looked up to find an older woman in a worn coat and a knitted scarf standing hesitantly by his table. She offered a small, apologetic smile. "I hate to bother you, but is anyone sitting here?" Isaiah straightened, offering her the kind of smile that made people feel at ease. "Not at all. Please take a seat." "Thank you," she said, settling into the chair opposite him. Her hands were weathered, and her scarf was frayed at the edges, but her eyes carried a warmth that reminded Isaiah of his grandmother. She placed a small, paper-wrapped sandwich on the table and offered him a polite nod. "You work around here?" she asked after a moment, her tone conversational. "In a way," Isaiah replied. He rarely mentioned his title in casual conversation, preferring to let people assume he was just another 9-to-5er grabbing coffee between meetings. It was easier that way. "Well, it's a busy day for everyone, isn't it?" she said, glancing around the cafe. "So much hustle and bustle. Sometimes I wonder how people find time to breathe in a city like this." Isaiah chuckled softly. "It's a skill, I suppose." Their conversation was interrupted by Bradley's voice cutting through the cafe again. He was now berating another employee, his tone even sharper than before. "Is it really that difficult to provide decent service? This place has gone downhill." The older woman at Isaiah's table shook her head, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Some people," she murmured, her voice low but resolute, "forget what it means to be kind." Isaiah nodded, her words resonating with him. He had built his company on the principle that power should be wielded responsibly, that leadership meant uplifting others rather than tearing them down. Yet the world seemed filled with people like Bradley, men who saw kindness as weakness and arrogance as strength. The tension in the cafe was palpable now, the room quieter as patrons averted their eyes from Bradley's tirade. Isaiah glanced at the barista, whose hands still trembled as she handed over the corrected order. Bradley snatched it without so much as a thank you, muttering something under his breath as he turned toward the exit. But as Bradley passed Isaiah's table, his gaze lingered for a moment. His eyes flicked over Isaiah's blazer, the polished leather briefcase resting by his chair, and the tablet on the table. For a brief moment, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. But it was quickly replaced by a dismissive smirk. Isaiah returned the look evenly, his expression unreadable. Bradley hesitated, as if considering whether to say something, before shaking his head and walking out the door. "People like him," the older woman began, but Isaiah held up a hand, his smile kind but firm. "It's not worth the energy," he said. "He'll learn, one way or another." The woman nodded, though her eyes lingered on Isaiah with quiet curiosity. "You have a good head on your shoulders," she said after a pause. "Not everyone does." Isaiah simply smiled, returning his attention to his coffee. Outside, the saxophonist's melody continued, rising and falling like a heartbeat against the noise of the city. Isaiah Carter left the cafe, feeling the weight of the city's relentless energy pressing against him. The early afternoon sun glinted off the skyscrapers, their reflective surfaces almost blinding, as he crossed the street to the parking garage. His SUV waited for him in its usual spot on the third floor, its sleek design blending in with the rows of high-end vehicles. The day ahead was packed. A board meeting at Altura's headquarters, a mentoring session with young entrepreneurs in the community, and a late dinner with a senator to discuss expanding tech opportunities in underserved neighborhoods. Isaiah relished the work. It gave him purpose. But he wasn't oblivious to the added challenges that came with his position. As he approached his vehicle, the low rumble of voices caught his attention. Two security guards leaned against the concrete wall, their uniforms crisp, but their postures relaxed, chatting idly. One of them, a wiry man with sharp features, straightened as Isaiah approached. "Hey there," the guard called out, his voice sharp enough to halt Isaiah mid-step. "Can I help you?" Isaiah blinked, glancing around. The parking level was sparsely populated, with only a handful of cars dotting the expanse. "No, I'm just heading to my car," he replied, gesturing toward the SUV. The guard narrowed his eyes, his posture shifting from casual to authoritative. "This your car?" he asked, the words loaded with unspoken suspicion. Isaiah kept his voice calm. "It is." The second guard, a stockier man with a buzz cut, stepped forward, eyeing Isaiah up and down. "Got any proof of that?" he asked, crossing his arms. Isaiah's brow furrowed, but he maintained his composure. "I have my keys," he said, pulling them from his pocket and pressing the button to unlock the vehicle. The SUV's lights flashed in response. "Still doesn't prove it's yours," the wiry guard shot back. "We've had some issues with, unauthorized access around here just doing our job." Isaiah paused, feeling the familiar churn of frustration in his chest. He knew what this was. He had seen it countless times before. The assumptions, the subtle accusation wrapped in the guise of policy. His tailored blazer and polished demeanor were invisible to these men. All they saw was a black man walking toward a luxury car. "Is there a problem here?" Isaiah asked evenly, slipping his tablet into his briefcase to free his hands. His voice remained calm, but a note of steel crept in. "Problem's not ours," the buzzcut guard said, tilting his chin toward the SUV. "Just seems like an odd fit. You know that car and, well..." He let the implication hang in the air. Isaiah took a slow breath, willing himself to stay measured. "I'd appreciate it if you'd be more direct." The wiry guard snorted. "No need to get defensive, just asking some routine questions." "Routine?" Isaiah's voice remained steady, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his effort to remain composed. "Because I've parked here for years, and this is the first time I've been stopped." The stockier guard's face flushed slightly, but he doubled down. "Maybe we missed you before policy's policy." Isaiah stepped closer to his vehicle, unlocking the driver's side door and placing his briefcase on the seat. "If you'd like, I can call the garage manager, he knows me well." The wiry guard waved a dismissive hand. "No need for that, just doing a quick check." His eyes lingered on Isaiah a moment too long before he stepped back. "You're free to go." Isaiah gave them a curt nod, climbing into the SUV without another word. As he pulled out of the parking garage, his grip on the steering wheel tightened, his jaw set. He could feel the churn of anger in his chest, the familiar weight of frustration pressing down on him, but he wouldn't let it consume him. Not today. He had more important battles to fight. The courthouse encounter. Isaiah's afternoon meeting with the board ran over, leaving him with just enough time to make it to his next appointment. A community outreach initiative housed in the city's historic courthouse, the courthouse, an imposing stone structure with weathered columns and sprawling steps, stood as a symbol of justice and power. Though Isaiah knew too well how often it failed to serve everyone equally. The halls inside were bustling with activity as Isaiah arrived. Lawyers in tailored suits strode purposefully, clerks shuffled stacks of paperwork, and defendants sat nervously on wooden benches. Isaiah nodded politely to the courthouse staff he recognized, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor as he made his way to the designated meeting room. "Excuse me, sir." A voice called from behind Isaiah, turned to see a uniformed officer approaching, his expression unreadable. "Can I see some ID?" Isaiah paused, his briefcase dangling at his side. "Is there an issue?" "Just a standard check," the officer replied, his tone neutral but firm. "You're not on the employee list for this floor." Isaiah resisted the urge to sigh. "I'm not an employee. I'm here for a meeting with the Community Outreach Program. My name is Isaiah Carter." The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly, though his expression didn't soften. "You got any credentials to prove that?" Isaiah set his briefcase on a nearby bench and pulled out his wallet, extracting his driver's license. The officer studied it briefly before handing it back. "Wait here," he said, stepping aside to speak into his radio. Isaiah leaned against the wall, his fingers tightening around the handle of his briefcase. Nearby, a young white man in jeans and a t-shirt walked past unchallenged, his earbuds in, and a styrofoam cup in hand. Isaiah felt the familiar weight of scrutiny pressing down on him like an invisible hand, heavy and suffocating. After a few minutes, the officer returned. "You're clear," he said simply, nodding toward the hallway ahead. "You can go." Isaiah nodded in return, his face betraying none of the simmering frustration inside him. As he walked to the meeting room, his mind churned with thoughts of the day's microaggressions. The security guards, the officer, the unspoken assumptions that seemed to shadow him wherever he went. But he wouldn't let it show. He had long since mastered the art of compartmentalizing, of swallowing his frustration, and channeling it into something productive. He had to be better. Better than their assumptions, better than their biases, better than their attempts to diminish him. The stakeholders' meeting. The meeting room was small but bright, sunlight streaming through the tall courthouse windows and illuminating the long table where a dozen stakeholders had gathered. Local leaders, nonprofit representatives, and a few members of the city council greeted Isaiah warmly as he entered. "Mr. Carter, so glad you could join us," said Sarah Ung, the program director. She motioned to an empty seat at the head of the table. "We're eager to hear your thoughts." Isaiah smiled as he took his seat, exchanging pleasantries with the others. For a moment, the tension from earlier seemed to dissipate, replaced by the familiar rhythm of collaboration and strategy. The discussion began, centering on plans to provide underserved communities with greater access to technology and education. Isaiah listened intently, offering insights when prompted and carefully navigating the politics of the room. He could feel the respect in their voices when they addressed him, the recognition of his expertise and authority, but not everyone shared that respect. Near the end of the meeting, a man sitting to Isaiah's left, a councilman named Richard Dunham, leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. Dunham had remained quiet for most of the discussion, his expression skeptical as others spoke. "Mr. Carter," Dunham said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "This all sounds good in theory, but I can't help but wonder, what's your stake in all this?" Isaiah raised an eyebrow, his expression calm. "My stake is ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to succeed, regardless of where they come from. I believe access to technology can help level the playing field." Dunham smirked. "That's admirable. But forgive me if I'm a little skeptical about a billionaire telling us how to solve systemic issues. No offense, but how much time have you actually spent in these communities?" Isaiah's jaw tightened imperceptibly, though his voice remained steady. "I grew up in one of those communities, Councilman. This isn't just a project for me, it's personal." The room fell silent, the weight of Isaiah's words settling over the table. Dunham shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing further. Isaiah leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "If we want real change, we have to stop questioning each other's intentions and start working together. I'm here because I believe this program can make a difference. If anyone doubts that, I'd be happy to discuss it further." The room remained quiet for a moment longer before Sarah cleared her throat and moved the conversation forward. But Isaiah could feel the lingering tension, the subtle doubts that clung to the edges of the discussion like shadows. The meeting adjourned with a chorus of polite goodbyes and handshakes, but Isaiah Carter could feel the weight of the councilman's veiled skepticism still pressing against his thoughts. He lingered in the room for a moment, collecting his papers and allowing the others to filter out. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his intentions, but coming from an elected official, the insinuation stung more than usual. "Mr. Carter," Sarah Ung said softly as she approached. "I just wanted to say thank you again for being here. I know this kind of pushback can be exhausting. Isaiah offered a small, tired smile. It's part of the job, isn't it? It shouldn't be, she replied, her tone heavy with frustration. But I appreciate your patience. I'll follow up with you soon about next steps. Isaiah nodded, watching as she left alone in the room. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, leaning back in his chair. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from his assistant, Gloria, lit up the screen. Gloria. Call me when you're free. There's a situation. Isaiah's brow furrowed. Gloria rarely overreacted. He gathered his things quickly, dialing her number as he made his way to the courthouse exit. Isaiah, Gloria said, as soon as she picked up, her voice tense. Are you still at the courthouse? Just leaving now, he replied. What's going on? There's a story circulating online, she said, pausing as if to measure her next words carefully. Someone leaked an old photo of you at that rally in Oakland, years ago, when you were protesting the police shooting. Isaiah stopped mid-step, his stomach tightening. He remembered the rally vividly. A heated, chaotic day, where the community's pain had spilled into the streets. The image Gloria referred to showed him holding a megaphone, his face resolute, as he stood in front of a line of riot police. The photo had become iconic within activist circles, but he knew how easily it could be weaponized by those looking to discredit him. What's the angle? He asked, already bracing himself. They're calling you anti-police, Gloria said. Some outlets are framing it like you were inciting violence, which we both know isn't true, but it doesn't matter, Isaiah finished grimly. The narrative's already out there. Isaiah pushed through the courthouse doors, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the stone steps. The sidewalks were busier now, thrumming with the city's constant movement. He pulled his keys from his pocket, his mind racing as he considered his next move. That's when he saw them. 2 uniformed officers standing near his SUV, their postures stiff and deliberate. One of them, a tall man with a square jaw, was pointing at the license plate. While the other spoke into his radio, Isaiah approached cautiously, his pulse quickening. Officers, he said evenly, stopping a few feet away. Is there a problem? The square-jawed officer turned, his expression unreadable. Is this your vehicle, sir? It is, Isaiah replied, holding up his keys. Is there an issue? We received a report about a suspicious vehicle matching this description, the officer said, his tone curt. Do you have proof of ownership? Isaiah's jaw tightened. He reached into his pocket, producing his registration and ID, and handed them over without a word. The second officer, shorter and stockier, scrutinized the documents before nodding. Mind telling me who made the report? Isaiah asked. That's confidential, the square-jawed officer replied. Just following up. Isaiah's grip on his briefcase tightened. If everything checks out, I assume I'm free to go? The officers exchanged a glance before the shorter one stepped closer. We'll need to run these documents through the system's standard procedure. Isaiah raised an eyebrow. Standard procedure for what I've just left a meeting in this courthouse, and now I'm being stopped because my car looks suspicious. Surely you can understand how this feels. The square-jawed officer's expression hardened. Sir, we're just doing our job. Your job, Isaiah repeated, his voice steady but sharp. Your job is to protect and serve, not harass people based on a flimsy tip. Watch your tone, the shorter officer snapped. We're not looking for trouble here. And neither am I, Isaiah replied, his calm exterior masking the churn of frustration building inside him. But I won't stand here and be treated like a criminal for going about my day. Before the officers could respond, a third figure appeared. Officer Daniels, whom Isaiah recognized immediately from the courthouse. Daniels had been present during one of Isaiah's earlier appearances in court, and their interactions had always been polite, if perfunctory. Everything okay here? Daniels asked, his gaze flicking between Isaiah and his colleagues. Routine check, the square-jawed officer said. This gentleman claims the vehicle is his. Daniels frowned, stepping closer to Isaiah. Mr. Carter, you're still here from the meeting? I am, Isaiah said, his voice edged with weariness. Apparently my car has caused some concern. Daniels hesitated, then turned to the other officers. He's clear, let him go. The shorter officer bristled. We're just following up on... I said, he's clear, Daniels repeated firmly. This isn't necessary. The tension hung in the air for a moment longer before the square-jawed officer handed Isaiah's documents back. You're free to go. Isaiah took them without a word, his face a mask of calm. As the officers moved away, Daniels lingered, his expression apologetic. I'm sorry about that, he said quietly. I didn't know they'd be. It's not your fault, Isaiah replied, though his tone carried a weight that made Daniels flinch. But you can understand why this keeps happening. Daniels nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. I do. And I wish I had a better answer for you. Isaiah didn't respond. Instead, he climbed into his SUV, the tension from the encounter thrumming through him like a live wire. As he drove away, his phone buzzed again. Gloria's name lit up the screen, but this time, Isaiah let it go to voicemail. Isaiah arrived at Altura Solutions headquarters an hour later, the sleek glass building standing as a monument to everything he'd built. But today, it felt less like a triumph and more like a fortress, a place to retreat from a world that seemed determined to test him at every turn. Inside, Gloria was waiting in his office, her expression a mixture of concern and urgency. We need to get ahead of this, she said as he entered. The photo is everywhere now. Some of the board members are already calling, worried about the fallout. Isaiah set his briefcase down, running a hand over his face. What exactly are they worried about? That I care about justice, that I stood with my community. You know it's not about that, Gloria said gently. It's about optics. You've always walked a fine line between being a CEO and being an activist. They're worried this will tip the scales. Isaiah leaned against his desk, his expression hard. Then maybe they should take a good look at the values we claim to stand for. If they think I'm going to apologize for caring about my people, they're sorely mistaken. Gloria hesitated. You know I'm with you, Isaiah. Always. But this isn't just about you. It's about the company, the employees, the clients. We have to play this carefully. Isaiah's jaw clenched as he considered her words. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, not just to himself, but to everyone who depended on him. He couldn't afford to misstep, but he also couldn't ignore the principles that had brought him this far. Gloria's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen and grimaced. It's Mitchell. Isaiah nodded. Put him through. Gloria handed him the phone, and Isaiah steeled himself as he pressed it to his ear. Mitchell! Isaiah! Came the voice of the board chairman, clipped and businesslike. We need to talk. Isaiah Carter sat at the edge of his desk, his phone pressed to his ear as the voice of Mitchell Porter, the Altura Solutions board chairman, came through loud and sharp. This situation is escalating faster than we expected, Mitchell said. The photo, the backlash, it's everywhere. We've got clients calling, the media speculating about your intentions, and some board members are already discussing damage control. Isaiah's jaw tightened. He could hear the careful calculus in Mitchell's voice, the measured tone of someone trying to balance optics against integrity. But Isaiah had heard this dance before. Damage control? Isaiah replied evenly. What exactly are we controlling, Mitchell? The fact that I stood up for something I believe in. It's not about what you believe, Mitchell shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. It's about perception. You know how these things work. People see a CEO at a protest, and they don't think, oh, he's standing up for justice. They think, is this company anti-police, anti-law and order? We can't afford that kind of narrative. Isaiah took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. You're worried about a narrative. What about the truth? That photo represents a moment when I chose to stand with my community after an unarmed man was killed. I won't apologize for that. Mitchell sighed, the sound heavy with exasperation. No one's asking you to apologize, but we need to issue a statement, something that clarifies your position and assures people that Altura is committed to neutrality. Neutrality, Isaiah repeated, his voice colder now. Neutrality in the face of injustice isn't neutrality, it's complicity. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Mitchell spoke again, his tone was softer, but no less firm. Look, Isaiah, I respect what you're saying, I do, but you have to think about the bigger picture here. The company's future is on the line. Isaiah closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the desk. He wanted to argue, to push back against the veiled ultimatum in Mitchell's words. But the truth was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. His decisions would ripple outward, affecting thousands of employees, shareholders, and clients. "I'll think about it," Isaiah said finally, his voice taut with restraint. "But I won't compromise my values." Mitchell's sigh of relief was audible. "That's all I'm asking. Let's regroup in the morning and figure out the next steps." The call ended, leaving Isaiah in a silence that felt heavier than the conversation itself. He set the phone down and turned to the window, his reflection merging with the city skyline beyond. The stakes had never felt higher. A sudden turn. Isaiah's assistant, Gloria, appeared at the door, her expression unreadable. "Isaiah, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice low. "Who?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "It's Officer Daniels," she replied. "And he's not alone." Isaiah's stomach sank. "Send them in." Moments later, Daniels entered the office, flanked by two other officers in full uniform. Their presence was imposing, their expressions grim. Isaiah stood, his hands resting on the desk as he met Daniels's gaze. "Officer Daniels," Isaiah said, his tone steady. "What can I do for you?" Daniels hesitated, the weight of the moment apparent in his eyes. "Mr. Carter, we need to ask you to come with us." Isaiah's brow furrowed. "What's this about?" One of the other officers stepped forward, his voice clipped and official. "We've received a warrant for your arrest in connection with an incident being investigated downtown." Isaiah blinked, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "A warrant for what?" "Disturbing the peace," the officer replied. "There's also a charge of inciting unrest tied to that photo of you at the protest." Isaiah's hands tightened into fists at his sides. "That was years ago. You know that this is absurd." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. "Isaiah, I don't think this is about the protest. Someone's pushing this from above. You've made powerful enemies." Isaiah's heart pounded, but his voice remained calm. "Then they're trying to intimidate me. I won't let that happen." The second officer stepped closer, handcuffs dangling from his belt. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Mr. Carter." Gloria moved to Isaiah's side, her voice shaking. "This is ridiculous. Isaiah hasn't done anything wrong." "It's okay, Gloria," Isaiah said, holding up a hand to calm her. He straightened his shoulders, his voice firm. "I'll cooperate, but I want my lawyer notified immediately." The officers nodded curtly, and Daniels looked away as the handcuffs were placed around Isaiah's wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, a physical manifestation of the injustice he had fought so hard to dismantle. Public spectacle. The ride to the station was quiet, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. Isaiah stared out the window, his mind racing. He wasn't afraid. Anger and determination burned too brightly within him for that. But he couldn't shake the humiliation of being paraded through his own building in handcuffs, his employees watching in stunned silence. When they arrived at the station, the media was already there, cameras flashing as Isaiah was escorted inside. The story had spread like wildfire. Tech CEO arrested amid protest scandal. Isaiah kept his head high, refusing to let the moment break him. Inside the station, Daniels guided him to a quieter area, away from the chaos. "Isaiah, I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I tried to push back on this, but it's out of my hands." "Who's behind it?" Isaiah asked, his voice steady, despite the storm inside him. Daniels hesitated before replying. "Councilman Dunham. He's been pushing to discredit you ever since that meeting claims you're a threat to public order." Isaiah's lips pressed into a thin line. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed only solidified his resolve. Dunham wasn't just challenging him, he was using the full weight of the system to try and destroy him. "Thank you for telling me," Isaiah said, "but I'm not going to let this stand." Allies in the darkness. As the hours dragged on, Isaiah sat in a holding cell, the sterile walls closing in around him. He used the time to think, to strategize. He knew the legal system well enough to understand his options, but this wasn't just about legal recourse. It was about fighting back against the corruption that had led to this moment. His thoughts were interrupted when Gloria arrived, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor. Behind her was Marcus Harlow, Isaiah's longtime attorney, and one of the most formidable legal minds in the city. "This is absurd," Marcus said, as he sat across from Isaiah, his tone clipped with controlled fury. "We'll have you out of here within the hour. I've already filed motions to dismiss the charges." Isaiah nodded. "It's not just about getting out, Marcus. They're trying to silence me. This is bigger than a few trumped-up charges." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll make it bigger. If they want a fight, we'll give them one." Gloria chimed in, her voice resolute. "The media's already turning this into a circus. We can use that to our advantage, shine a spotlight on the people pulling the strings." Isaiah leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "Good. Let's show them what happens when they try to weaponize justice. I'm not backing down." As the conversation continued, Isaiah's resolve crystallized. He would fight this battle, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of systemic injustice, and he would win. Just as Marcus was finalizing the paperwork for Isaiah's release, a commotion erupted outside the station. Voices rose in anger, and the distant rumble of chanting grew louder. Gloria moved to the window, her eyes widening. "It's a protest," she said, turning back to Isaiah. "They're here for you." Isaiah stood, the gravity of the moment settling over him. He knew this was a turning point, a chance to take a stand not just in the courtroom, but in the streets. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's time." The scene outside the station was chaotic, the air thick with tension. Supporters held signs demanding justice, their voices rising in defiance of the forces working against Isaiah. Cameras flashed, reporters jostling for position as Isaiah emerged, flanked by Gloria and Marcus. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Isaiah raised a hand, silencing them. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. This was the moment he had been building toward, the moment he would decide how far he was willing to go. "I am not a criminal," Isaiah began, his voice steady and clear. "I am a man who believes in justice, and I will not be silenced." The crowd roared in response, their energy surging around him like a wave. Isaiah stood firm, his heart pounding as he prepared for the battle ahead. The crowd outside the police station was electric, their chants reverberating through the humid evening air. Signs with slogans like, "Justice for all," and "Stand with Isaiah" swayed above the throng of people who had come together to support him. The media buzzed around the edges, cameras capturing every moment, every expression. The atmosphere was charged, teetering on the edge of chaos, but rooted in a collective resolve. Isaiah Carter stood on the station steps, his gaze steady, as he addressed the crowd. The flashing cameras and rising cheers barely registered in his mind. He was focused on the task ahead. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about exposing the corruption and prejudice that had brought him here. He hadn't spoken more than a few words before the doors of the station swung open behind him. Councilman Richard Dunham stepped out, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying a sharp edge of annoyance. Flanking him were Officer Daniels and the square-jawed officer who had arrested Isaiah earlier. The noise from the crowd dimmed as Dunham raised a hand, demanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth but laced with condescension, "I appreciate your passion, but let's not lose sight of the facts. Mr. Carter is facing legitimate charges brought forward through proper channels. This is not a matter of personal vendettas or systemic issues. It's about accountability." Isaiah turned to face him, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He took a step closer, his voice calm but resolute. "Accountability? Is that what you call this? Trumped-up charges and a smear campaign based on a years-old photo? You're not interested in accountability, Dunham. You're interested in control." The crowd murmured in agreement, their energy shifting. Dunham's jaw tightened, but he maintained his polished veneer. "I have no personal vendetta against you, Mr. Carter, but actions have consequences, and no one is above the law, not even you." "Then let's talk about actions and consequences," Isaiah countered, stepping forward until they were mere feet apart. "Your actions, Councilman, like the backroom deals you've made to protect the same people who perpetuate injustice, like your efforts to suppress funding for community programs while you funnel taxpayer dollars into private projects that line your pockets." The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts, the weight of Isaiah's words crashing over them like a tidal wave. Dunham's polished mask cracked, his eyes narrowing with barely contained fury. "This is slander," Dunham spat, his voice rising above the noise. "You can't stand here and make baseless accusations." "They're not baseless," Isaiah said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He turned to the cameras, his expression unyielding. "I've seen the contracts, the kickbacks, the emails you thought you'd buried, and I'm not the only one who's seen them tonight. The truth will come out. Every dirty deal, every betrayal of the people you claim to serve." Dunham's face flushed red, his composure slipping further. "You have no proof?" Isaiah didn't flinch. "The proof is already in the hands of people who won't stay silent. This isn't just about me, Councilman. It's about everyone who's been crushed under the weight of corruption and bias while people like you profit." The crowd roared in support, their chants growing louder as they surged closer to the station steps. Dunham took a step back, his confidence faltering as the weight of public scrutiny bore down on him. The confrontation. Before Dunham could respond, Officer Daniels stepped forward, his expression conflicted. "Mr. Carter, let's take this inside," he said, his tone low but firm. "We need to talk." Isaiah studied him for a moment, noting the tension in Daniels' stance. This wasn't an invitation, it was a demand. Isaiah nodded, glancing at Gloria and Marcus, who stood nearby. "Stay with the crowd, I'll handle this." Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Daniels led Isaiah to a small, dimly lit room, shutting the door behind them. The square-jawed officer stood against the wall, his arms crossed, while Dunham paced near the table, his hands clenched into fists. "You've crossed a line," Dunham snarled, his polished demeanor fully unraveling. "You think you can just smear my name in front of a crowd like that? I'll destroy you." Isaiah met his glare without flinching. "The only thing being destroyed here is the system you've built on lies. The truth is coming out, Dunham. You can't stop it." Dunham slammed his fist on the table, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I've built this city. Carter, people like you don't belong in my world." Isaiah's chest tightened, but he kept his composure. "That's where you're wrong. This isn't your world. It's ours, and it's time we take it back." Daniels stepped between them, his expression strained. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Both of you." "Are you seriously siding with him?" Dunham snapped, turning on Daniels. "After everything I've done for you?" Daniels hesitated, his gaze flicking to Isaiah. The conflict in his eyes was evident, but after a moment, he straightened his shoulders. "I became a cop to do the right thing," he said quietly. "Not to cover for people like you." Dunham's eyes widened, his fury giving way to disbelief. "You ungrateful—" "Enough," Isaiah said, his voice commanding. He turned to Daniels. "You know what's right. The question is, are you willing to do it?" Daniels took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing on him. Finally, he nodded. "I'll testify," he said. "About the pressure to bring charges against you, about the deals I've seen Dunham make. I'm done being part of this." The revelation, the door to the room burst open, and Marcus stepped in, his expression triumphant. "Isaiah, you need to see this." Isaiah followed Marcus into the main station, where Gloria was standing in front of a television. The screen showed a breaking news segment, the anchor's voice barely audible over the crowd outside. Leaked documents obtained by an anonymous source appear to confirm allegations of corruption involving Councilman Richard Dunham. The documents include emails, financial records, and recorded conversations detailing kickbacks and misuse of public funds. Isaiah turned to Dunham, whose face had gone pale. "The truth always comes out," Isaiah said quietly. "You should have remembered that." Dunham's mouth opened, but no words came. He stumbled backward, his career, and his carefully constructed power, crumbling before his eyes. The crowd outside grew louder as the news spread, their cheers echoing through the station, but Isaiah's mind was already racing. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. As Daniels and Marcus discussed the next steps, Gloria approached him, her expression serious. "You've got the momentum," she said. "But this fight isn't over. They're going to come after you harder now." Isaiah nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let them. We've come too far to back down." He stepped toward the station doors, the energy of the crowd pulling him forward. This was his moment, a chance to lead not just by words, but by action. The future was uncertain, the stakes higher than ever. But Isaiah Carter was ready. The police station conference room was silent, but for the rhythmic hum of the overhead fluorescent lights, Isaiah Carter sat at the rectangular table's far end, his posture poised but tense. Across from him sat Councilman Richard Dunham, his carefully constructed facade now visibly cracking. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of unspoken truths, the kind that could topple careers and reshape entire systems. Officer Daniels hovered near the door, his shoulders squared but his eyes betraying unease. The other officers in the room, two who had been complicit in Isaiah's arrest, stood rigid, their presence a reminder of the power dynamics at play. The weight of the stakes pressed down on Isaiah, but his resolve was unshakable. Today would not end with his silence. "Let's get to it then," Dunham sneered, breaking the quiet. His tone carried the sharp edge of desperation, masking his underlying panic. "You've made quite the spectacle of yourself, Carter. Do you honestly think you can play the martyr and come out unscathed?" Isaiah leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "This isn't about me. It's about the people you've hurt, the communities you've robbed, and the lies you've built your power on." Dunham scoffed, but the flicker of fear in his eyes betrayed him. "Lies, careful with your accusations, Mr. Carter. Baseless slander won't save you." Isaiah smirked faintly, a calculated move meant to unsettle his opponent. "Baseless? Let's talk about the contracts you awarded to shell companies owned by your friends, or the housing initiative funds you diverted to build luxury condos. The receipts are in the hands of every major news outlet as we speak." Dunham's composure slipped further, his lips twitching, as if he were trying to form a rebuttal, but couldn't. He turned sharply to Daniels. "This is absurd. Arrest him for obstruction or whatever else you can think of. Shut him up." Daniels hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. He looked between Dunham and Isaiah, the conflict in his expression evident. "Do it!" Dunham barked, his voice cracking with fury. "No!" Daniels' voice was steady, but firm. He straightened his posture, stepping closer to Isaiah. "I've been following your orders for too long, Dunham. I've seen what you've done, what you've made us do, and I'm done being your pawn." Dunham's face turned a deep shade of red, his fury overtaking him. "You'll regret this, Daniels. You're the one who'll regret it," Isaiah interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This ends today, Dunham. The world will see you for what you are, a liar, a thief, and a coward." As if on cue, Gloria entered the room, a tablet in hand, her eyes locked with Isaiah's as she nodded, her calm demeanor carrying an air of triumph. She placed the tablet on the table, turning it so that Dunham could see the screen. "Breaking news," she said, her voice steady. "Emails, financial records, even surveillance footage, all tying you to at least a dozen counts of fraud and embezzlement. I suggest you watch." The color drained from Dunham's face as the tablet's screen illuminated his misdeeds. The emails were damning, outlining backroom deals and schemes to divert city funds. Video footage showed him meeting with developers in dimly lit restaurants, exchanging briefcases and shaking hands. "This is doctored," Dunham stammered, his voice trembling. "It's fake." "It's real," Gloria replied coldly. "And it's everywhere. Your time's up." Dunham lunged toward the tablet, his desperation overtaking him, but Daniels stepped in, blocking his path. "Sit down, Councilman," Daniels said, his voice laced with authority. "You're not going anywhere." "You'll regret this," Dunham hissed, his bravado crumbling. "All of you?" Isaiah rose to his feet, his presence commanding. "You built your power on fear and exploitation, but you underestimated one thing: the strength of people who refuse to stay silent." Dunham slumped back into his chair, his defeat written across his face. Isaiah turned his attention to the officers who had arrested him, their postures rigid with unease. "This is your chance," he said, his voice firm but empathetic. "You can choose to stay silent, to keep protecting people like him, or you can stand on the right side of history." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Daniels, who nodded in quiet encouragement. After a moment, the officer stepped forward. "I'll testify," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about the false reports and the orders to arrest you." The second officer followed suit, his head bowed. "Me too. I'm done being part of this." Isaiah nodded, gratitude flickering in his eyes. It's not too late to do what's right. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, their chants echoing through the station walls. Gloria's phone buzzed with notifications, tweets, headlines, and videos of the protest flooding the internet. The story was out, and there was no containing it now. Daniels opened the door, gesturing for Isaiah to follow him. "It's time," he said simply. Isaiah walked with purpose, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but his resolve unshaken. As he stepped out onto the station steps, the crowd erupted into cheers. The energy was electric, a wave of hope and defiance that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Isaiah raised his hands, calling for silence. When the noise subsided, he spoke, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who knew the power of truth. "Today is not the end of this fight," he began, his words measured but fierce. "It's the beginning. We've exposed one corrupt figure, but the system that allowed him to thrive is still standing. We must keep pushing, keep demanding justice, and hold every person in power accountable." The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers reverberating through the city streets. Isaiah felt the weight of their hope and determination, a burden he carried willingly. As the crowd chanted his name, Isaiah's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. A text from Marcus read, "We've got a bigger problem, call me now." Isaiah's heart sank as he pocketed the phone, his mind racing. The battle against Dunham was over, but the war was far from won. Whatever awaited him next, he knew one thing for certain. He would face it head-on, just as he had today. With a final wave to the crowd, Isaiah turned and walked back into the station, ready for the fight that lay ahead. The courtroom was packed. Media personnel crowded the back rows with cameras rolling, their lenses trained on the central figure of Councilman Richard Dunham, who sat hunched at the defense table. Gone was the confident, domineering man who had stood on the courthouse steps days before. In his place was a man visibly unraveling, his polished exterior cracked under the weight of the evidence presented against him. Isaiah Carter watched from the gallery, his presence commanding even in silence. The charges against him had been dismissed within hours of the revelations, and now the focus had shifted to the man responsible for orchestrating his public humiliation. Dunham's arraignment had become a flashpoint, the symbol of a system teetering on the brink of accountability. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent as the prosecution began presenting a damning summary of the case. Emails, financial records, and witness testimonies painted a vivid picture of corruption, abuse of power, and calculated deceit. Dunham squirmed in his seat, his confidence eroded as each piece of evidence stacked higher against him. Isaiah felt a deep sense of vindication, but it wasn't personal satisfaction he sought. This moment wasn't about him. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed men like Dunham to thrive. As the prosecution continued, Isaiah's mind shifted to the broader implications of what was unfolding. In the weeks following his arrest and exoneration, Isaiah had become the reluctant face of a growing movement. Supporters rallied around him, not just because of his fight with Dunham, but because he represented something bigger: the possibility of change. Isaiah had been thrust into a spotlight he didn't seek, but refused to shy away from. He met with community leaders, activists, and policymakers, leveraging his platform to push for systemic reforms. The experience had hardened his resolve, but it had also softened his approach in unexpected ways. He found himself listening more, learning from voices that had long been silenced or ignored. One evening, Gloria had commented on how much he'd changed. "You were always determined, Isaiah," she'd said. "But now you're inspiring people to be determined too. That's a different kind of power." Isaiah had smiled at her words, but deep down, he knew the transformation had come at a cost. The ordeal had tested every ounce of his strength and forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the world and himself, but he had emerged stronger, more focused, and more determined than ever. Outside the courtroom, the movement Isaiah had sparked continued to grow. Protests gave way to town hall meetings where citizens demanded transparency and accountability from their elected officials. Grassroots organizations mobilized to address the systemic issues exposed during the fallout of Dunham's case. One of Isaiah's proudest moments came when the city council passed a sweeping anti-corruption bill, introduced in response to the scandal. The legislation included stricter oversight for public officials, protections for whistleblowers, and increased funding for underserved communities. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. Isaiah had stood in the council chambers that day, watching the vote with a mixture of pride and determination. When the bill passed, the room erupted in applause, and for a brief moment, Isaiah allowed himself to feel the weight of what they'd accomplished. Later that night, he addressed a crowd gathered outside City Hall. "This isn't the end," he'd said, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's the beginning. Real change takes time, persistence, and all of us working together. But today, we've proven that change is possible." Isaiah returned to his office the day after Dunham's arraignment, the weight of the past few weeks finally settling on his shoulders. The room felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a battlefield. The framed awards and accolades lining the walls seemed distant, almost trivial in the face of what he'd been through. Gloria entered with 2 cups of coffee, her expression softer than usual. She set one on his desk and took a seat across from him. "Long morning?" she asked. "Long month," Isaiah replied with a faint smile, taking a sip of the coffee. "But it's starting to feel worth it." "It was worth it the moment you stood your ground," Gloria said. "The rest of this, it's just proof that you were right to fight." Isaiah nodded, her words settling over him like a warm blanket. He thought of all the people who had rallied around him, the voices that had joined his, the momentum they'd built together. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of peace. "I couldn't have done it alone," he said, meeting Gloria's gaze. "None of us can." She smiled, raising her cup in a toast. "To what's next?" Isaiah's phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from the moment he glanced at the screen and saw a message from Marcus. "Marcus, call me ASAP. Something's brewing, could be big." Isaiah frowned, his mind already racing with possibilities. He set his coffee down and reached for his phone, but Gloria stopped him with a gentle hand on his wrist. "Take a minute," she said. "Whatever it is, it can wait." Isaiah hesitated but relented, leaning back in his chair. He knew the fight was far from over. There would always be more battles to face, more injustices to challenge. But for now, he allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, to reflect on how far they'd come. As he looked out the window, the city stretched before him, vibrant and full of life. It wasn't perfect, but it was changing. And so was he. The fight against corruption and systemic injustice had only begun, but Isaiah Carter was ready for whatever came next. His journey had shown him the power of resilience, the strength in unity, and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, Isaiah felt hopeful. He turned back to Gloria, his voice steady and sure. "Let's get to work." Isaiah Carter stood on the rooftop of Altura Solutions, the city sprawled before him like a living, breathing organism. The skyline glimmered with countless lights, each one a reminder of the lives that made up this complex, imperfect place. For weeks, his days had been consumed by a whirlwind of legal battles, public appearances, and late-night strategy sessions. Now, for the first time, he allowed himself a moment to pause and reflect. The events that had unfolded were a crucible, testing the core of who he was and what he stood for. Isaiah had always believed in the power of perseverance and integrity, but this ordeal had deepened his understanding of what it meant to fight for justice. It wasn't just about standing up for oneself, it was about standing with others, amplifying their voices, and challenging the systems that perpetuated harm. He thought back to the moment of his arrest, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists. He had been humiliated, stripped of dignity, and paraded before the world as a criminal. But that moment had also ignited something within him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. He had faced down a corrupt councilman, exposed systemic wrongdoing, and emerged stronger than ever. Isaiah had always been resilient, but this experience had reshaped him in profound ways. Before, he had believed that change was incremental, a slow and steady march toward progress. Now, he understood that sometimes change required bold action, even if it meant stepping into uncomfortable spaces and risking everything. His growth wasn't just about the strength he'd gained, but also the humility he'd found. He had come to see the power in collective effort, in leaning on others when the weight of the fight became too much to bear. Gloria's unwavering support, Marcus's legal expertise, and Daniels's unexpected courage had been instrumental in turning the tide. Their contributions reminded him that no one could shoulder the burden of systemic change alone. Isaiah's next steps were clear. He planned to expand Altura's community programs, using the company's resources to fund initiatives that addressed systemic inequities. He also intended to collaborate with activists and policymakers to push for broader reforms, from criminal justice to public housing. His battle with Dunham had proven that when people stood together, even the most entrenched power structures could be challenged. Isaiah's journey was deeply personal, but it reflected a larger truth about the world. His arrest, the smear campaign, and the attempts to silence him were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a broader system that often prioritized power over justice. Racism, corruption, and abuse of authority were not new problems, but they were problems that demanded continuous confrontation. The people who rallied around Isaiah weren't just fighting for him. They were fighting for themselves, their families, and their communities. His experience became a rallying cry, a symbol of the injustices faced by countless others. The leaked evidence against Dunham and the resulting reforms were victories, but they were also reminders of how much work remained. For Isaiah, the systemic problems were like weeds. Cutting them back wasn't enough. They had to be uprooted entirely, their roots exposed for all to see. This required vigilance, persistence, and the willingness to disrupt the status quo. Isaiah's story resonated with people far beyond the confines of his city. Emails and letters poured in from strangers who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. A high school teacher wrote about using his story to inspire her students. A single mother shared how she found hope in his determination to stand against injustice. Activists across the country reached out, seeking partnerships and offering solidarity. These connections reminded Isaiah that his fight was part of something much larger. His actions had sparked conversations and mobilized people to challenge the systems that had failed them. The movement wasn't about one man. It was about the collective power of individuals working toward a common goal. Isaiah wanted people to understand that progress wasn't inevitable. It was earned. It required courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But he also wanted them to know that change was possible. The success of the anti-corruption bill, the growing momentum for reform, and the voices that refused to be silenced were proof of that. As the city hummed with life below, Isaiah turned away from the edge of the rooftop and walked back inside. Gloria was waiting for him in his office, reviewing a stack of proposals for their next community initiative. She looked up and smiled as he entered. "Big night tomorrow," she said, referring to a town hall event they'd organized. "You ready?" Isaiah nodded, a quiet confidence in his expression. "I'm always ready." Gloria tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "You know, you could take a break. No one would blame you." Isaiah chuckled softly. "There's no time for breaks. Besides, this isn't just about me anymore. It never was." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the pride she felt in him. "Well, if anyone can handle it, it's you." Isaiah picked up one of the proposals, flipping through its pages. His mind was already racing with ideas, plans for the future. The challenges ahead were daunting, but he felt a deep sense of purpose driving him forward. As the night stretched on, Isaiah reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the voices that had joined his, the people who had stood by him, and the lives they'd touched together. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope, a belief that change, no matter how difficult, was within reach. The story of Isaiah Carter was not just about one man's struggle against injustice. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of collective action. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one voice could inspire a chorus, and one act of courage could spark a movement. As Isaiah prepared for the next chapter of his journey, he carried with him the lessons of the past and the hope of a brighter future. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew that he would never walk it alone. And that, he thought, was the greatest victory of all.